may we have open and ready minds to see your word. And if there are defects in this presentation, I pray that you would reveal those as well. And please help me not to get in the way of your word. We're grateful. Please shut us in with your presence here. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, 7 steps to 1844. Now look, I have had a project of trying to boil this down to make it simple, because when it's too complex, people can't remember it, they can't understand it, it doesn't make sense, and they can't share it, right? And it's important because if 1844 is the beginning of the end, the last phase of atonement history, then we have a lot of imminence. Christ is about to come soon. So this means a lot to us. It also means, if this is true, that it validates the experience of our Adventist pioneers. Because if they were all wrong about that, then they were all wrong about everything, because that was core to their experience. And Ellen White, of course, recognized that, and the others did as well. So what I've tried to do is to look for how in the text of Daniel 8 and 9 we can find simple, logical steps to find our way to the conclusion. All right. So that we can demonstrate to others. We're not just making this up. Now, it's true that Adventists are generally regarded as historicists. We believe in a sweep of history that includes recognizing that days can represent years and things like that. There are others who have other approaches, like preterists. They think it was all in the past. This little horn power in Daniel is all fulfilled by Antiochus Epiphanes, way back there in the past. And then there are the futurists. No, it's all in the future. And there are the idealists. It's just all abstract. It doesn't really refer to anything solid. And then there are what I call not just the historicists, but the hystericists. And those people that get all wild and bent out of shape with all kinds of theories, wanting to predict a date for Christ's coming. Now, interestingly, most Christians were historicists up to a point, but then in the Counter-Reformation, you see the reformers, Martin Luther, and those reformers, we just celebrated 500-year anniversary of the nailing of the 95 Theses. The reformers were historicists. They knew who the little horn was. They knew who the Antichrist was. And I've been in the Luther Museum in Wittenberg, Germany, and I've seen the tracts, very old tracts that were published then, with the picture on the front of who the Antichrist was, and they knew exactly who that was. That was the papacy. But then, in the Counter-Reformation, the Church of Rome tried to counterattack by saying, no, it's not us. The bad guy went that-a-way. We don't care if you believe it's in the past or the future. The church embraced both. Now, they're mutually exclusive. It couldn't be that and that. But they didn't care. Yeah, let's take both of them. Went that-a-way, anywhere but here. Because if you're historicists and you see that sweep of history, all roads lead to Rome. All right, let's go through this. First step, the 2300 days. Now, you know the text of Daniel 8 and 9 quite well, right? I'm assuming that. If you need to follow along, you can. I'm just referring to it. The 2300 days are longer than literal days. That's step number one. And this is a little bit small. If evenings, mornings, can you see that? That's a little hard to see. You can? Maybe my eyes aren't so good as they used to be. You can see, good, all right. If evenings, mornings, see in Hebrew it's evening, morning, which means evenings, mornings. Evening, morning, that is days in Daniel 8:14. If they were literal days, 2,300 days would be about 6 1/3 literal years. Okay? That makes sense, right? However, the 2,300 days covers the entire period of Daniel's chazon, his vision of Daniel 8. Covers the entire period. And that includes many kings whose reigns, their individual reigns, lasted a lot longer than 6 1/3 literal years. So, in other words, the time period that it covers has too much history in it. It can't possibly be days. Does that make sense? In other words, you don't have to talk about a day-year principle or anything like that. You just say, in terms of the context is king in Hebrew interpretation. In terms of the context, that expression, which is an unusual expression for days, evening, morning, must be a symbolic usage. Okay. The vision covers many centuries: Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, sanctuaries cleansed. Too much history to be literal days. And in fact, it's interesting that the Hebrew word yom, which means day, can, in the plural, it can mean years. If you say yamim, it can mean years instead of days. There are a number of passages where that can take place. And I've got those in my little book, Who's Afraid of the Judgment? All right, we won't take the time to go into all of that. It's also in a presentation I'm doing, I think on Sabbath, Objections to 1844. I've got it there. All right, so too much history. Step number 2. Daniel 9 explains Daniel 8. Babylon was conquered by Medo-Persia in Daniel 9, verse 1. Now, in Daniel 9, verse 1, it says that Daniel was studying the books of, especially Jeremiah. He was studying these prophecies of God in the first year of Darius the Mede. That's what it says. Darius the Mede. And you say, so what? Why do we need to know that it's in the first year of Darius the Mede? Well, here's why. Because Babylon was already conquered by Medo-Persia when Daniel is doing this study in Daniel 9. Why would he be studying? Well, the 70 years of captivity were ending. Jeremiah 25 says that God's people would be under the domination of Babylon for 70 years. Babylon is already gone now when Daniel is here in Daniel 9. It's gone. So obviously Daniel is saying, wait a minute, what about that prophecy of Jeremiah? When are we going home to our home, the promised land? And what about the temple? What about the people? But the vision of Daniel 8 predicted a series of empires. Now, why shouldn't Daniel be very happy when Darius the Mede came, the Median king? Well, it's the end of the 70 years, isn't it? See? God is, or just almost the end, God is about to let my people go free. Daniel should be overjoyed. He should be rejoicing. But instead, he is mourning. He's fasting. He's got sackcloth. What's the matter with Daniel? Is he just a chronic melancholy? You know, some people who just have a long face no matter what happens. Happy occasions, doesn't matter. They're always melancholy. Is that no, because Daniel has gotten some information in Daniel 8. He's received the vision in Daniel 8, which predicted a series of empires. Now, did Daniel believe that was 6 1/3 literal years before the problem would be solved? If he believed it was 6 1/3 literal years, that is the 2300 in Daniel chapter 8, verse 14, would Daniel be upset? If I told you that in 6 1/3 years we're going to have peace in the Middle East, is that good news or bad news? It's incredible news. It's great news. Daniel should be jumping up and down. Only 6 more years and then we all go home. It's wonderful. But no, he's very upset. Daniel was not a preterist. Daniel didn't believe that it was 6 1/3 literal years. You can see in his reaction that he didn't believe that. He believed that it was a very long time with a series of empires, and he was very upset because the question obviously in his mind is, has God changed his mind? Because my people are so wicked that 70 years captivity is not enough. It's going to have to be much longer. He doesn't know when it's going to end, but he knows it's much longer. See? Okay. Daniel understood that days refer to much longer units than literal days. Does that make sense? You don't have to be a psychologist to read his body language and understand what's going on with Daniel. Okay, Gabriel came to explain the mar'eh, the vision, which is regarding the 2300 days. There was another word called chazon, which is a word for vision that covers the whole vision, but another word for vision is used of this little interlude where there's a holy one speaking, another one speaking, and one says, how long is the vision of all of this stuff going to take place? And the answer comes back, under 2,300 days. And then in verse 26, this is called the mar'eh of the 2300, evening, morning, okay? So Gabriel came to explain that part. Daniel had already received an explanation of the vision as a whole, but the one part he didn't know about was the time element. That's what was disturbing him. When are my people going to get to go home? And that's what Gabriel came to explain. All right, so Daniel 9 explains Daniel 8. That's step 2. There's no vision in Daniel 9. See, Daniel came to explain a mar'eh, a vision, but there is no vision in Daniel 9. It has to be the vision of Daniel 8 that he's come to explain, to give more information. Now, this linkage between Daniel 8 and Daniel 9 is what non-Adventist scholars have not seen. They haven't understood. The context, we're only interpreting the Bible in context. I'm not saying I'm a historicist, therefore I have to believe this way. All I'm doing is just saying step by step, let's just go to the Word and let's see how it interprets itself and how it makes sense. Okay? All right. So, the 70 weeks. Now, by the way, on that note, let me just take you back to step 1 and point this out. See this here? The vision covers many centuries, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, then the sanctuary cleansed. How do we know that those are Medo-Persia and Greece? How do I know that? That is not just my theory, that it's actually representing Medo-Persia and Greece. How do I know that? Because it says it explicitly. In Daniel 8, verse 20, it says that the ram represents the kings of Media and Persia. And in the next verse, verse 21, it says, and the goat represents Grecia, and the bighorn is the first king. And not even the preterists, nobody says anything other than that has to be Medo-Persia and Greece. They do other things with the little horn, but Medo-Persia and Greece nobody messes with. And those are already much longer than 6 1/3 literal years, you see. So we can just go to the Word, go to that anchor point, go straight to those verses to explain that vision. You look at the vision and then here's the interpretation. That's it. It's got to be a sequence of empires like that. There's no guesswork involved. You don't have to say I'm a historicist or whatever you are. You just go and let's read the Word together. We don't care. All right? Okay, so now step number 3. The 70 weeks begin in 457 BC. Okay, so Gabriel comes to explain the mar'eh. And he says to Daniel, there's going to be 62 weeks plus 1 week. Okay? Well, there's 7 weeks and then 62 weeks. And then he later says that there's another week at the end. All right, so 7 plus 62 plus 1. That's a total of 70 weeks. All right. But the 70 weeks would begin when a command to restore Jerusalem would go into effect. This happened in 457 during the 7th year of Artaxerxes I. Now, I told you that I've debated with my friend Desmond Ford. You may have heard of him in Australia, a very brilliant man who has made it a lot of his career to tear down 1844. And the reason for that is largely because he doesn't believe that God's people will have victory over sin before Jesus comes. See? And if there is a beginning of the judgment, there is an end of the judgment. If there is an end of the judgment, a true close of probation before Jesus comes again, then it's true what Ellen White says in The Great Controversy, that we will stand before a holy God without a mediator after Christ stops his heavenly intercession. See? And that means that Ephesians 5:27 is going to be true, that God's people will be without blemish or spot or any such thing, because Christ has washed us with the washing of water with the word. It's not what we do. And also, Revelation 19:7 and 8, that the white linen of the bride is the righteous deeds of the saints. You see? Ford doesn't want to accept that. And so, if there's a beginning of the judgment, there has to be an end. If there's an end, then God's people must have received this victory over sin, not in themselves, but receiving it from God, that God gives before the second coming. And everyone will be lost if they didn't receive that. So for Ford, he wants to get rid of the beginning of the judgment, 1844. Because if there's no beginning of the judgment, there's no end. He says it's just all back at the cross. See? All right. Now, he's debated with me about this, and he says, no. The going forth of the decree in Daniel 9:25 to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, see, is the restoration of Nehemiah. He's the one who finished building the city walls. And that was 444 BC. You Adventists, he's no longer an Adventist, have the wrong date. But no, I did a little bit of investigation. I told you that looking at the Hebrew, it's not enough to just read your Bible superficially in a translation, okay? I investigated in Hebrew. What does it mean in the Hebrew language to restore a city? Is that talking about building the walls like in Nehemiah? I discovered that term, the hifil of shuv, to restore, with the direct object, a city, means to restore a city to its former owner, to give ownership back. And in Ezra chapter 7, that's exactly what happens. In the 7th year of King Artaxerxes I of Persia, ownership, control, civil control of Jerusalem, it was the first of 3 Persian decrees to mention Jerusalem. Okay? Civil control was given back for the first time since the captivity because Ezra was to appoint judges, and they were to actually run the city by the law of God, and even to put to death those who wouldn't go along with that, who broke God's law with capital punishment. See? So civil control, ownership came back to the Jewish people in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, and we know when that was. That year began in 458 BC, and it goes to 457 BC. And we know that the decree went into effect in 457, the latter part of that king's regnal year that overlaps 2 of our years. How do we know that his regnal year was 458 to 457? Because we have correlations between records of ancient Near Eastern people with solar eclipses so that we can date kings' reigns astronomically to the day, starting with the reign of Nabopolassar, the father of Nebuchadnezzar. We have that precise a reckoning. And there is a book by Parker and Duberstein that tells you exactly what day of what reign correlating with our calendar. We can correlate with our calendar because it's dated astronomically by the correlation of eclipse, at least one eclipse. All right? So it's very precise. All right, this happened in 457 during the 7th year of Artaxerxes. Ezra and company put into effect the king's command to restore civil control of Jerusalem to the Jewish people. So the 70 weeks begins in 457. That's step 3. All right, step 4. The 70 weeks are weeks of years. The Messiah would come at the end of 7 plus 62 equals 69 weeks. The Hebrew word for week refers to a unit of 7, whether days or years, and you can find that in the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament by Köhler and Baumgartner. If you look there under the word Shavua, which means week, it has weeks of days, and then it has weeks of years. Now, these are not Adventists, these dictionary makers, but under weeks of years, he gives Daniel 9, verses 24 and 25, the following verses, weeks of years. Because that dictionary maker recognizes that too much is happening during that period of time. It couldn't possibly be weeks of days. Okay, the context indicates years, too much history for days. It's covering the time from Medo Persia, the time of Daniel, all the way to the coming of the Messiah, which we have in the New Testament. And then the 483 years from 457 is AD 27. No 0 year, otherwise you would get a different date. Okay, no 0 year, otherwise you would get 26 AD. Jesus became the Messiah. He was anointed by the Spirit. And the New Testament uses that terminology, anointed of his baptism by the Spirit, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Now again, the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. We know when Tiberius began to reign. It was 14 BC. You can look it up on Google, in Wikipedia, anywhere. It's public domain. He was a big shot. We know exactly the day that Augustus died and he became king. And then Tiberius, the first part of his regnal year, the Jews would have counted to Augustus until the new year, and then his first year would begin. Or that would start his second year. So the first year would be the incomplete year, a short time, until the new year, and then second year. And counting that way, it nails it. The 15th year of Tiberius is right in 27-28 AD, exactly when Daniel said. So Jesus kept his appointment just when the Bible says he would. And there's that external verification there in that one place that hooks in and confirms for us the time prophecies of Daniel, the 70 weeks. All right, that is step 4. Now step 5, the 490 years are the first segment of 2,300 days. The 70 weeks of years are cut off from one end of the 2,300 days. Now that word cut off, is chatak in Hebrew, is only used here in the whole Hebrew Bible. Nowhere else. So how do we know what it means? It can also mean to decide or to decree or to determine. How do we know what it means? Well, it's used in rabbinic writings quite a bit. And the basic meaning of the word is to cut something off from a longer segment. So you have a string or a cord or a rope, and you chatak, you cut off something from the longer segment. Now, by extension, that idea of cutting off can refer to determining or decreeing. Like I say, cut a deal. I don't know if you use this in Norway, but in English, you can say we cut a deal. We make a deal, right? And in the Akkadian language of Babylon, the expression to cut a decree, that's the terminology that was used. If you make a decree, you cut a decree or cut a verdict, like a judge cuts a verdict. Parasu purusu, okay? In Akkadian. That's some Babylonian language, huh? I teach that language at the seminary. How can you call people out of Babylon if you don't know the language of Babylon, right? All right. Okay, so the 70 weeks of years are cut off, and that also means determined or decreed for the Jewish people. The 70 weeks give details of the near future, the first part of the 2,300 days. Okay, so Daniel was concerned about what's going to happen to his people in the near future. So Gabriel came to explain that part of the vision that is closest to him. That's the first part of the 2,300, right? And that makes sense because after the 70 weeks, Daniel 9:27 says, "And on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate." Okay, so after the 70 weeks, you have desolation. Jerusalem is destroyed. That's after the 70 weeks. And then you have all this desolation, which reminds you of the little horn. And back in Daniel 8, the little horn power is doing desolation, this kind of stuff. That's the language that's used, same verb. And that is happening after the 70 weeks. So that means the 70 weeks are the first segment of the longer period of the 2,300. Does that make sense? All right. In other words, the 70 weeks are not the end of the 2300. It's from one end or the other. Which end? The first end. Because the other bad stuff happens after that, and because Daniel is concerned about the first events. All right, this refers to events after the 70 weeks, during the rest of the 2300 days. So, the 70 weeks of years equals 490 years. We know because it can't be just days, it's years. 490 years is the first segment, the first portion of the 2300 days. Now we're almost there, and the last movements are rapid ones, okay? The 2300 days are 2300 years beginning in 457. If the first segment of the 2300 days is 490 years, we know this. The 2300 must also be years. Okay, if you have 490 years, you can't take 490 years out of 6 1/3 years, can you? It can't be literal days. Look at it this way. This is rather strange. You know what a Chihuahua is? A little tiny dog. My wife has one. Okay, we have a Chihuahua. He's mixed with other things, really, or she. Very cute dog. A Chihuahua cannot give birth to a Great Dane. You know what a Great Dane is? Okay? It's not going to work. Or an elephant. It's not going to work. Okay, so if something, it has to be bigger than what is within it. Okay? All right, that's an illustration, a bad one, but okay. The 2300 days must be years. For days as years, see also some other passages where that can happen. Now you see, Adventists have tended to say there's a day-year principle. Whenever you see a day in this kind of prophecy, apocalyptic prophecy, you just automatically say it's a year. I don't do that. That's given historicism a bad name. For one thing, it doesn't work because you get to the millennium and you have 1,000 years. That's in the book of Revelation. It says 1,000 years. Does that mean that it's really 360,000 years? No, nobody says that. Why not? Because we have to take every passage within its own context. Context is what determines the meaning of these passages and the meaning of words. In any language, context is what determines. And all biblical scholars say that. They will not argue with that. So rather than saying there's this principle that you just automatically apply, I say, no, look at it, see what the options are, and if it doesn't fit that it's literal days, then it must be symbolic. And here it has to be years. Okay, so the 2300 days must be years. For days as years, you can find other passages where that can happen, so that is an option, and we're showing that in this context, that must be also the case. The starting point of the 2300 is the same as that of the 490 years, which we know is 457. Now all we have to do is a little bit of calculation. 2300 years from 457 is AD 1844. Now if you take your calculator and you punch in those numbers on your calculator, you're not going to get 1844. You're going to get 1843. Because your calculator has 0 in it. See? But there was no 0 year. Nobody wanted to live in the 0 year. See? There was BC 1 and AD 1 next to each other. There was no 0 year. And that's what the early Millerites had not understood when there was a disappointment in 1843. They thought the world was going to end in 1843. And they were wrong. Then they realized, oops, no 0 year. It stretches 1 more year to 1844. Okay, so that's what happens. In 1844, the sanctuary would begin to be cleansed or justified through a judgment in heaven, and that's the message that we talked about earlier in the previous presentation. All of that applies now to what happens here. So if we understand solidly in 7 steps, one building on another. I used to work as a student in California to make a living by doing a lot of different things. Anything that was legal. I never sold drugs, okay? But I did anything legal. And I taught piano, I did landscape maintenance. I did property management. Another thing I did was construction work. And when I worked with carpenters, I discovered that carpenters generally have pretty good theology because they understand that something must be built on something. You can't build something on nothing, because sometimes theologians do that. You know, they get so abstract, they build something on nothing. But I've tried to build step by step, okay? All right, so through a judgment in heaven that happens, this must be God's temple in heaven, because the Jerusalem temple was destroyed in 70 AD. It must be the temple in heaven in Hebrews 8 and 9, because 1844 is long after the Jerusalem temple was destroyed. God's end-time judgment is happening now. Now, for me, it's not so crucial that it happened in October 22, and I'll talk about that for a moment. For me, the most important thing is 1844. Why? Because that's in the past with reference to my life, which means it's already going on now. It's been going on the whole time. Okay? October 22 was very important for those early believers because that was the Day of Atonement. Now, if you look in a rabbinic calendar, you will find that that was not the Day of Atonement in 1844, according to the rabbinic calendar. The Day of Atonement in that year was September 23, I believe it was. September 23. So why did the Millerites say it was October 22? They knew the rabbinic calendar because they realized that the rabbis had changed the calendar because they were dwelling in all kinds of countries where it was not near the land of Israel. But the calendar was established in the days of Jesus. The biblical way of figuring a new year, was when it came time, when the old year was ending, it was about time for the new year. Then the priests would go out and they would look at the crops and they would see, is the barley going to be ready in 2 weeks or so for the elevated sheaf, not waved, but lifted up to God, dedicated to first fruits of the barley harvest, which is the first grain in the spring. Is it going to be ripe then? If it was not going to be ripe then, because of weather or because they had a lunisolar calendar and it slipped with regard to the solar year, right? Because there's only 454 days in the lunar year, the movement of the moon. And so if it slipped, or if the weather was cold and the barley is not going to be ripe, they couldn't start the new year then. So they would stick in another month, a 13th month. That's called intercalation. And that's what happened in 1844. The weather was cold, and the Millerites were observing what the Karaite Jews, not the rabbinic Jews, not the Jews that we know of, the mainstream, it's the Karaites. It's a small sect of Jews, and there's a Karaite synagogue in Jerusalem. I've seen it. And they were observing, because these people lived in the land of Israel, this group, and they were watching the harvest, and that's the way they were counting at that particular time, apparently. Okay, and we're looking for more documentation on that, but we know that the Millerites were going on that basis, that it was not ready, and so there was an extra month. That's why October, not September. Okay, I'm going to leave it there, and we'll take any questions or comments. I don't want to wear out the saints, right, with the everlasting gospel. But I have another whole presentation on objections to 1844, which I'll be presenting on Sabbath, I believe. Is that correct? Oh, it's on Sunday, maybe. Okay, but you have the program, and everyone knows the program. Okay, so on Sunday, and that's a couple of hours drive from here. But if you want to ask any questions, I'll be happy to answer here. If I know the answer, if I don't, I'll be very dogmatic. I'll say, I don't know. Okay. Jesus is coming soon. That's the punchline. Okay, any comments or questions on that? Or about the earlier presentation, or anything on the sanctuary you want to ask me. So this is the 2 presentations I'm doing in Lillehammer, and so anything you want to ask me, if I know, I'll tell you. If I don't, I'll tell you that too.
Just one thing. Clearly in Daniel 8, we have it's has the Day of Atonement imagery and theme. You know, you have the ram and the goat.
Yes.
Both sacrificial animals on the Day of Atonement. You have 8 horns. You have 4 horns on the one and 8 horns altogether. And then I was wondering, perhaps, is the evenings and mornings also an allusion to the sanctuary? You know, the evening and morning sacrifice.
Okay. Now, what the preterists do, the people who say it's all in the past, they want to say that these are literal years, but they don't want to say that it's 2,300 literal years. They want to cut it in half. Why? Because they want to fit it with Antiochus Epiphanes, and he persecuted the Jews and did bad stuff at the temple, you know, pigs on the altar and that kind of stuff, for a period of, how long was that? It was, I forget exactly how long it was, but no, it was 3 years and 10 days, something like that, okay? So they want to split that 2,300 into 1,150 to make it close to the time, which is not the exact time, it's less that Antiochus persecuted the Jews, but for them it's close enough, you know, close enough. Imprecise. And the way they do that is by saying, these are 2,300 evening morning. Therefore, that's 2,300 morning and evening burnt offerings. 2,300 morning and evening sacrifices. But there's several problems with that. It doesn't work. Because for one thing, it's evening morning, it's not morning evening. For another thing, it doesn't say sacrifices. For another thing, it doesn't fit the context of how long it needs to be. So there's just all kinds of problems. It doesn't work. So does the evening morning refer to morning and evening sacrifices? No, because the order is wrong. But does that mean that it can refer to something else? Now, Adventist scholars have pointed out it can refer to Genesis. The evening and the morning were the first day, and so on, right? So evening and morning make one day. And you can see also that in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses went up on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. See? That doesn't mean 20 days. It means 40 days, 40 full days. So 2,300 evening morning doesn't mean half of that. It means 2,300 evening and 2,300 morning. But the 2,300 evening morning is just an abbreviation for the much longer expression, 2,300 morning and 2,300 evening and morning. Now, what in the sanctuary, though, is evening morning? Can you think of any cycle? And the other thing in Daniel 8 that is there in the sanctuary is the word tamid, which means continual or regular. See that word? The word kodesh, which means holy or sanctuary. You have a ram and a goat. Remember I told you that for the people, there's this combination of animals that is killed for the people, the purification offering goat, and then it's a male goat, and then the burnt offering ram. You remember that? Well, in the book of Daniel, what are the symbolic animals? It's a ram and a goat, reversing the order. And often in the Hebrew Bible, when something is referred to, it reverses the order. So it's referring to the Day of Atonement. And it's tamid, it's regular, to deal with the sanctuary, the Kodesh. There's all kinds of connections with the sanctuary. But what about the evening morning? Well, if you look in the book of Exodus, there is one regular cycle, ritual cycle that is evening morning. It is the lamps in the sanctuary are to be lit from evening until morning. And then the priest would tend the lamps, and in the evening he would light them again, and they would burn throughout the night, evening to morning. And there would be one of these evening-morning cycles once every 24 hours. Okay? So that again confirms we have 2,300 days, or we could say 2,300 nights, which in a way is better because, you see, that lamp is very, very significant. It means that, Psalm 121, verse 4, he who watches over Israel slumbers not nor sleeps. See? God is awake. His light is on in the sanctuary. It means you see that light on and you know that he's watching over you. Furthermore, on the lamps, what were the lamps shaped like? Almond blossoms. So what? Why almond blossoms? Because in Hebrew, the word shaked, almond, is from the root shakad, that means watchful. The almond is the first tree to blossom in the spring. It's the watchful one, the awake one, when everything else is asleep. And so it symbolizes watchfulness, which is why in Jeremiah 1, God says to Jeremiah, young Jeremiah, what do you see, Jeremiah? I see an almond tree, or an almond branch, or whatever. And God says, that's right, because I'm watching over my word to perform it. Now, it makes no sense in English, no sense in Norwegian, but in Hebrew it makes perfect sense, because it's words from the same root. He uses the almond because shaked, because I'm shakad, watching over my word to perform it. So you see, this lampstand is representing God's watchfulness, and it's from evening to morning. And so all the sanctuary imagery is telling me that through these 2,300 days of long, or nights of darkness in the world, with all these great empires and this bad stuff happening, God is watching over his people, and the pilot light is lit for the full blaze of his glory to come back on the sanctuary. And I think that's a wonderful message.
And we see that also with his relationship to the candlesticks in Revelation.
Yes.
The same relationship as the priest, keeping them watch, keeping them burning.
Absolutely. And the Holy Spirit is represented by the lampstands, because you got the 7 spirits of fire there in Revelation chapter 4. And in Zechariah, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit. Zechariah 4 verse 6, right? And so the spirit connected with lamps and God's watchfulness is a very powerful combination in the Bible. Yeah. All right. Maybe I've worn everybody out. See, I haven't worn myself out. I get excited about this. I'm not an extrovert. I'm a textrovert. I get energized by text. Okay. Did you have another question? You took my sanctuary class at the seminary, didn't you? Wow, that's great. So these are advanced questions beyond that, right? Okay.
Where is the resurrection in the sanctuary service?
Where is the resurrection of Christ in the sanctuary typology? That's a very good question. I'll tell you where it is. It's in the elevated sheaf, because Paul makes that connection explicit. In 1 Corinthians 15, he said, Christ, the translations often say wave sheaf, but the Hebrew actually means lifted sheaf, raised sheaf. It's a sheaf of barley that was raised in connection with Passover on the day after the Sabbath. The day after the Sabbath, right? And there was a big dispute among the Jews, when is that? Is it the ceremonial Sabbath or the weekly Sabbath? But in the Gospels we find that Christ was raised to life on a high day. What did that mean? The ceremonial Sabbath and the weekly Sabbath came on the same day, so nobody could argue. And on the day after the Sabbath, Jesus was raised. Now, what day did Jesus rest? On the Sabbath, in the tomb. He didn't rest on Sunday. He was walking around going everywhere. The Sabbath was still Jesus' day of rest. Okay? And then he was raised to life, and that was represented by this sheaf of barley that was on the day after the Sabbath in connection with Passover. And Paul explicitly makes that connection in 1 Corinthians 15. It says, Christ, our elevated sheaf. And what's the significance of that sheaf? That's the first fruits of a much greater harvest. And then the harvest comes at Pentecost, you see, the harvest of ingathering of people come. And then ultimately, in a larger sense, the resurrection. Christ is being raised to life, and Paul makes the connection, and he's the first fruits to show that we all will also, those who have died in the faith, will be raised to life as well. So that's where the resurrection is in the sanctuary.
Another question. The major objection to the 1844 is that there was nothing in the world events that seemed to be solved in any way with the living born or its activities or anything like that at all. And related to that, none of the other spring festivals took 170 years to complete, like the death of Christ or the resurrection or the Pentecost, etc. They did one day, basically, 1-to-1 ratio. Why should we
Yeah. So, in other words, the spring festivals, so the year went from the spring to the fall in Israel, right? The year began in the spring. Nisan is the first month, the month of Passover. It's about March, April, right? And so the spring festivals, there were 3 spring festivals. There was Passover combined with unleavened bread. So unleavened bread was the pilgrim festival that they would have to come. Passover, unleavened bread, connected with that sheaf. And then, so that's 1, 2, and then the third one is the Feast of Weeks. After 50 days, after that elevation of the raising of that sheaf, then there was the Feast of Weeks, which is known as Pentecost. Pentecost, see, because 50, Penta. Okay, so that was Pentecost. And so these were fulfilled on the day. Jesus died at the time of Passover. He was raised at the time of the elevated sheaf. And this is all connected with the Feast of Unleavened Bread, right? And then Pentecost is the pouring out of the Spirit. Apparently what happened is that he was inaugurated as our high priest in heaven, our king priest, Melchizedek priest. And then he in the New Testament talks about he went on high giving gifts unto men. So he gives the gift of the Holy Spirit when he's anointed as the high priest in heaven. And so those are fulfilled on those days. What about the fall festivals? What about those? We have 3 fall festivals, holy days. We have the first day of the 7th month, the so-called Feast of Trumpets. And then 10 days later on the Day of Atonement, we have the Day of Atonement. And then we have on the 15th day of the 7th month, we have the festival of Sukkot, which is booths, badly translated tabernacles. Israelites were supposed to live in booths like when they left Egypt. Okay? So we have these fall festivals. Now what do they correlate to at the end? The meaning, and this, I'll try to make this brief. The Day of Atonement, I think we've established that correlation with 1844, that it needs to be that. You can't see anything on earth that's going on. But before that is sometime before that is the Festival of Trumpets. Now, in Hebrew, in Leviticus 23, verse 24, this is called Zikaron Truah. Now, Zikaron means a memorial or a remembrance, and the word Truah means a shout or a trumpet blast for various reasons. And in the Bible, it could be signaling war, like in Numbers chapter 10, or a Truah could be in Numbers 23, verse 21. Balaam looks down on the camp of Israel, and he says, there's a Truah of a king in the camp. Meaning, this is a royal war camp. It was God's war camp. He was inspired when he said that. So, is this festival signaling war? No. What meaning could it have? It makes perfect sense that it's signaling re-announcement, confirmation, reacclamation that God is king of his people. Right? That makes good sense in that context. And then it makes good sense a few days later on the Day of Atonement, a day of judgment. What does a king do when he becomes king? What's the first thing that he does after he becomes king? Okay? What did Solomon do? Look at 1 Kings. What did Solomon do? He became king. He's anointed and proclamation. Then what does he do? He judges among his subjects. Some are loyal, the sons of Barzillai. Some are disloyal, Adonijah, his brother, Joab, and the high priest who went along with Adonijah, his brother. See, they were wanting to take the kingdom. So the rebels you deal with. And so you have the kingship and then the judgment. And this also in the ancient Near East, this was the order. Okay? And then you have the celebration at the Festival of Booths. So what would the Festival of Trumpets correlate to in the end time that would really make sense? God's kingship is being re-proclaimed. Well, to me it makes sense, and I won't be dogmatic about this. This is just my theory, okay? But it makes sense to me that in Daniel, he said, you are the head of gold, and he saw these 4 great kingdoms: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, and then the end. And so they're the great empires in domination over God's people. When did the period of domination of God's people by the great empires really come to an end? We're talking about Rome, the Empire of Rome, and then the Church of Rome. The Church of Rome would be a time when the power was really at a very low point, which we find in the book of Revelation as being significant in Revelation 13. The deadly wound, the mortal wound, that is then after that healed. Okay? So that low point would be a time then of freedom, so that God's sovereignty, God's kingship, is reasserted in the world. And that would have to be 1798, when Berthier, Napoleon's general, took the Pope captive, and the Pope died in captivity. It was a real low point. And at that point, all kinds of things start to bust loose. And we see things in the world happening. Besides that happening, we see the decipherment of ancient languages, because Napoleon's troops were in Egypt. They found the Rosetta Stone. They were able to decipher the Egyptian hieroglyphic language. A lot of archaeology gave light to the Bible, a lot of evidence about the Bible, and then also great missionary movements. A lot of things happened right about then, because the power of Rome was so weak, a lot of others could go and God's message could go. And then in the wake of that comes William Miller preaching this message, and then 1844. So I think we don't have no evidence at all. It's not a total lack of evidence for things going on in the world about that time. Now, what is the Feast of Booths? See, we have longer periods of time. It's not like the spring festivals. There's more time between these events. And so I would see, and I could be wrong, that the Feast of Booths, which was the harvest festival, that's the ultimate harvest. When is the harvest in Revelation? That's at the end, Christ's second coming. And then we have the marriage supper of the Lamb, the great celebration in the festival. So that's what I'm seeing. I could be wrong, but anyway, you asked, and so I answered. Made myself vulnerable, but... Maybe, is everybody getting tired? I don't want to wear everybody out.
Yeah, that's very true.
We should bring it to a close here, you think? Yeah. Okay. Let everyone get home and get some good rest.